and welcome to the Jordan Center. I am incredibly grateful for everyone showing up on the last day of the semester, a Friday into the holiday weekend. So it's wonderful to see you here today. Welcome to people who are watching live stream or watching the video recording as well. I'm Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center, and it is my great pleasure to welcome my friend and longtime colleague, Sam Green, who is the director of the Russia Institute at King's College London and a senior lecturer in Russian politics. Before that, when we first met, he lived and worked in Moscow for 13 years, and most recently was the director of the Center for the Study of New Media and Society at the New Economics School, which was doing a lot of very interesting work with media and technology early on. His book, if you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend it, is Moscow and Movement, Power and Opposition in Putin's Russia, and was published in August 2014 by Stanford University Press. Sam's going to talk to us today, so it's a great pleasure that I welcome. So please join me in welcoming Sam Green here to the Jordan Center. Dr. Green, I believe, is the British tradition.
No, it's Dr. Green is my dad, as they say. There's a couple of people sort of sitting behind poles that I can't really see very well, and there's space up in the front, and I promise not to throw anything at anybody.
Yes, we're ironically a Russia Center with a giant pole.
We can interpret that in the Q&A. So thank you, thanks Josh, thanks to also to Heather for helping me get here, and to the Center for the invitation. It strikes me that there's a shared history between the Jordan Center and the Russian Institute at King's. Jordan Center, I think, is a little bit older. We're about 5.5 years old now at King's, but both were created at a time when most universities were closing Russia projects, not opening new ones, long before anybody knew what was going to happen in Ukraine or Trump or anything else, right? So long before anybody thought that Russia was kind of a going concern when it came to the field. And so it is very gratifying to see the success of the center here and the community it's able to bring together, as Josh was saying, even towards the end of the day, towards the end of the semester, towards the end of the year, towards the end of everybody's attention span. So I will try to keep this relatively short and sharp, and hopefully Josh will keep me honest, particularly on the short part. Essentially what I want to talk about is power in Russia, and this is a conversation I've been trying to have in a couple of places. I think Yana has seen me give something very similar to this talk before, around trying to set out some ideas for hopefully sort of my next research project. So please lay into this with anything you think doesn't make sense when we get to the Q&A. This is very much conceptual. So I think the first thing to think about is, what do we really know about power in Russia? And when you read, whether you're reading the academic literature or you're reading, the New York Times or increasing sections of the contemporary politics, a bookshelf in your local bookstore, we tend to do two things, right? We tend to sort of characterize power in Russia somewhere on a spectrum between democracy and authoritarianism. Most evaluations of that have been gliding towards the authoritarianism end of the spectrum. You do have outliers. Masha Gessen has made the argument that Russia is totalitarian. That is an outlier argument. We can come back to that if you want. But it's usually somewhere on that spectrum, and again, tending towards the autocracy end. We also tend, as part of that, to characterize the elite as powerful. So the people at the top end of the political and economic hierarchy, and the masses as being broadly disenfranchised. Right? We talk about elites as powerful everywhere. That's why they're elites. But we tend to think of the masses in Russia as being particularly disenfranchised. Right now, even if both of these things are broadly true, and I wouldn't dispute them, I don't think it's sufficient to explain a lot of the things that we see in Russian politics when we look deeper. And this is partly because most of the study of power in Russia sort of runs through the study of formal things, right? So we're studying formal institutions, formal political behaviors, participation in votes, even in protests, which are a kind of formal political behavior, even if they're not allowed by the state. Right? We put a heavy emphasis on on coercion, right, both physical and ideological coercion. But I think we're missing something, and I've been motivated in thinking about this by a somewhat more sort of sociological approach to the study of power, right? So in at least the parts of sociology that I read and that make sense to me, power, I think, can be understood to be produced in a process of interaction, a process of challenge and resistance, right? Which over time, as you challenge an order, you challenge a distribution, you challenge an institution, you begin to crystallize either the existing institutional order, right? The structures of dominance and domination, right? Or you create new ones, which then in turn crystallize, right? So in the sociology literature, there's a great book by Flickstein and McAdam on strategic action fields that sort of describes how this comes about. But one of the key intuitions of that is that in a settled field, what they call the strategic action field, right? In a field in which everybody knows their role, in which everybody understands where the power lies, there isn't actually any power present, right? Because if you think of power as, if you define power as the ability to force people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise want to do, to act against their own interests, right? Then once institutions are crystallized, but once institutions are set and everybody knows who is powerful, your behavior is shaped by your expectations rather than by coercion. Right? So you don't challenge that if the expectations of losing are strong enough. It's only when a challenge emerges that you actually discover whether the institutions in fact are powerful, the actors who are enabled by these institutions are powerful enough to coerce behavior to prevent a challenge, right? Or whether in fact that power can be redistributed. Another perspective on this comes from a book looking at Vichy France, actually, by a sociologist at Northwestern named Ivan Yermakov, right? Who talks about the threats that often induce actors, particularly political actors, to forfeit what otherwise might have been in a rational evaluation, kind of their own interests. Right. One of the things that Yermakov says is that the threats in and of themselves, right? So in his book, this is the threats to the leaders of Vichy France trying to decide whether or not they were going to acquiesce to the Germans, right? The threats don't work themselves on an individual basis. It's not a process of individuals making individual decisions, right? It's all happening in a social environment, and it happens because groups of people, as a group, conceiving themselves as a group and aware of the perceptions of other people in the group, allow themselves to be impressed, right? Allow themselves to feel threatened, right? And that allowance is the product of this kind of process of interaction, both between groups and within groups. So in the end, the intuition is that we acquiesce to power if we're on one end of the spectrum, or we believe that we wield power if we're on the other end of the power distribution, right? Most often because we see similar beliefs reflected in other people, right? In what they say and how they behave. And if you think about your own decisions, our own decisions, when we think about how to vote, whether to take part in a protest, we do look around for signals of solidarity. We do want to understand how we will stand as a result of that behavior or that opinion that we hold vis-a-vis the people around us, right? So that's the theoretical background, and I'll put that to one side, right? What does this mean for Russia? Right? The classical description of Russian citizens, right, is that they're passive. And one of the most prominent Russian sociologists, who I really don't want to get into an argument with, Lev Gudkov, right, talks at length about what he calls the inertia of passive adaptation. In other words, people have learned to cope with all of the dysfunction in the state, right? And rather than challenge that, rather than create collective approaches to try to make the state function either better or function more in a way that would be beneficial to them, they simply adapt passively to whatever comes their way. The coping argument I wouldn't challenge. I do have a problem with the passivity argument. I've in other places described Russian citizens not as passive, but as aggressively immobile, right? And that's not just a semantic difference, right? Passive people can be pushed, passive people can be led, right? It takes some effort, but it can be done, right? Whereas what I see when I look at Russian citizens are people who cling purposefully and powerfully to the structures and the ramparts that they have built for themselves to create their own prosperity. Right? And that is a phenomenon that has developed really over the last, I think, 30 to 40 years or so. Right? So you can think of a story of a young man growing up in Leningrad, not too long after World War II, right? Who gets it in his head that what he really wants to do with his life is join the KGB, right? And guess who this young man might be, right? But from what we know from the closest thing we have to his autobiography, right? It wasn't by cultivating relationships, by finding connections, bless you, by finding ways into the KGB that he was able to achieve this. He got a piece of advice early on, which was put yourself in the right place at the right time, which in this case meant get yourself admitted to the law department at Leningrad State University, right? Be talented, be visible, and if we're interested, somebody will tap you on the shoulder, right? Which is what happened. And the rest, as they say, is the history of the March 2018 presidential election. But the Soviet experience, we know about Blat and Svyazy, right? We know about all of the uncertainties and the ways that people coped with that. Those uncertainties increased and deepened as the scarcity of goods and services available to Soviet citizens increased through the late 70s and into the 80s. There is uncertainty and individualized coping mechanisms and informality in any political economy anywhere in the world, right? But many of the key life cycle challenges for most of the Soviet experience were still structured by formal institutions, right? Access to education, jobs, career structures, cradle-to-grave services, right? As a result, for somebody like Putin growing up as a young man in Leningrad, right, the way to get where he wanted was to be in the right place at the right time, which is essentially the definition of a well-institutionalized, impersonally institutionalized political and economic environment. Transition changes all of that, right? Because obviously the state disappears and then attempts to reconstitute itself. The entire logic of political and economic constitution changes very rapidly, and what you have is an undermining of both institutional structure and signaling. Right? So if you think again from a sociological perspective about institutions as being not simply things written on paper in buildings with walls, right? But things that are sets of rules and understandings that help people build expectations, right? That you walk into an interaction with somebody, a transaction with somebody. You don't know who that person is, but you know what role you expect that person to play, right? Because you know what this setting is all about. You know what the purpose of this transaction is. So you know what. If you do X, you know you can expect Y to be done by your interlocutor. Again, more or less regardless of who that person is, right? As in the 90s, post-Soviet institutions ceased to structure these expectations of people in any reliable way, right? What you might think of as sort of the cognitive distance between citizens and the state increases. In other words, the state plays less and less of a role in people's decision-making processes, right? You've got a government in Moscow that is saying, we've got a 500-day plan, we're reforming the economy, we're going to get prices under control, we're going to privatize, we're going to create enterprises that you can interact with. That has no meaning to the vast majority of people who have got to deal with the difficulties of day-to-day life in the context of hyperinflation and scarcity and well, everything else we know about the 90s, right? A lot of great ethnographic work was done in Russia in the 90s to look at how this was impacting people's behavior, and so people like Sarah Ashwin wrote about patience, right, and how that was underpinned by people's coping mechanisms, things that Lev Gudkov talks about, right? Michael Burroway and his colleagues talked about involution, right? So turning inward away from sort of, again, impersonalized, modernized, institutionalized solutions to highly localized solutions, relying on the people you know and the settings you know, right? But when we were writing about that, or people older than me were writing about that, and we were reading about that in the 90s, we all assumed that to be transitory, right? That this was something that should pass as the economy stabilizes. That these were temporary reactions to deinstitutionalization. Of course, at the same time, people like Joel Hellman were writing about how elites, right, could be, and in fact did, entrench deinstitutionalization to entrench their own advantage, right? If you're at the top of the system, you have informational advantages. You're able to know more about these uncertain situations than other people are, right? So why would you want that to become institutionalized and transparent? And we took that to a certain extent. We have taken that for the last number of years as a core explanation of why the old formal institutions that broke down with the end of the Soviet Union haven't been replaced with similarly powerful new formal institutions that would allow people to get back to the kind of certainty, even if it's a different certainty, that Putin, for example, was able to benefit from as a young man in Leningrad. Right? But I'm not entirely convinced that that's the answer. I don't think it's only about elites. And that's sort of the story here, right? Whatever prosperity has been built by post-Soviet citizens in Russia, right, has been built in this deinstitutionalized environment. And Russians are, by and large, now more comfortable, more prosperous than they ever have been. There's been a dip in the last few years, but not to such a degree, right? So if in the early years we could talk about Russians surviving and coping despite the institutionalization, I think at this point in 2017 we have to understand that people have thrived to whatever degree they have thrived because of deinstitutionalization. They found ways to prosper, to build islands and ramparts for themselves, almost by definition, because there had been no other conditions in which to thrive, right? So we need to understand how this deinstitutionalization is understood by people, how it fits into people's own strategies and responses, right? So in the paper, which I'm happy to send around, I take a look at three essentially cases in which the state tried to actually introduce some impersonalized institutional rationality to some important aspect of people's lives, right? So one case is the Unified State Exam, beginning gосударственный экзамен, right? So traditionally, entry into universities in Russia was obtained by sitting an exam administered by the university to which you wanted to gain entry, which usually meant that you had to go to the university itself, you had to be interviewed by their professors, right? And this, of course, has a number of consequences, but three core unintended consequences. It limits mobility, right? So if you are a brilliant student in Magadan, you're smart enough to study at the universities in Moscow or St. Petersburg, you have to find a way to actually get to Moscow and St. Petersburg to take this this exam, right? It contributes to imbalances in higher education, and it allows the great universities to become better and the gaps between weaker and stronger universities to grow. And of course, it provides rather obvious opportunities for corruption. Right? You're having essentially, in many cases, a one-on-one interaction with the person who's going to decide your education, which does presumably have some impact on your earning potential in life, right? So, state comes up with a textbook reform, right? You create this unified state exam as a school leaving exam that every student takes when they finish their secondary education. in Russia, it's a standardized test, so it's criticized for all the reasons that everybody around the world criticizes standardized tests, right? But many people in Russia objected to the tests for other reasons as well, right? So for parents who were seeking to get their kids a leg up in life, right, the old system, while difficult and corrupt, was legible. Right? If you weren't able, through formal means, to get your kid where you wanted to get them, right, you knew who to talk to, you know who the person was, and you knew essentially how to structure that transaction. It had to be done in a personalized way. You had to have the right connections and be able to do the right negotiation. The new system, based on this exam, is by design impersonal, right? And so it undermines all of these sort of involuted or personalized approaches to problem solving that had worked for a generation and a half or so of post-Soviet parents getting their children into universities. Right? Did a couple of other things as well. It pushed corruption from the university level down to the schools, right? So you would get schools now helping to get students the right test results. And the country's best universities also opposed it because it undercut their ability to remain elite universities. So they actually, in a number of cases, were able to get permission to have additional entry exams. Higher School of Economics, for example, has additional entry exams for its students. Case number 2, monetization of benefits. Right? So again, you have a textbook reform. Right? People of various social categories, particularly pensioners, but not only, right, have habitually in Russia gotten in-kind benefits, right? So pensioners would get a free bus pass, right, for example, or free pharmaceuticals. Right? A policy of providing every pensioner with a free bus pass, right, which then of course requires the state to pay a subvention to the transportation company in every city, right? Based on the number of pensioners in the locality, assumes that every pensioner wants or needs a bus pass. Right? And the same is true essentially for the way all of these in-kind benefits are delivered. So there's a problem of waste. Right? And the textbook sort of, World Bank, IMF kind of way of solving this problem, right, is to go for cash benefits. Right? Is that you give people the money that would allow them to purchase the benefits they would otherwise have gotten, but then they can use that money in whatever way they see fit. Right? Citizens, as we know from the protests that then emerged in early 2005 after this was launched, right? Citizens resisted, and the cash for benefits reform was undermined by a lack of transparency first and foremost. Right? So there was no way for recipients to see how the in-kind benefits, right, they had been used to getting would be translated into cash. And there was absolutely no trust that this would happen in a manner that would be sufficient. Right? But it also was impersonalized. Right? So you didn't go to an individual to get your cash. It simply showed up in your bank account. And that for people was an unsettling thought, right? If the extra money they received was insufficient, there was literally no one you could go and complain to, except to go out and complain to Putin in the streets, right? Elites, again, also resisted, right? So some powerful regional leaders, particularly Yuri Lushkov in Moscow, but also Mantuleyev in Kemerovo and Shaimiev in Tatarstan, would use their own budgets, right, to top up the benefits that were available to pensioners in their regions. Right? In this case, they actually pulled their regions out of the cash for benefits reform and were able to maintain these sort of natural in-kind benefit provisions to pensioners and other recipients in their region. Right? Not, I think, for purely altruistic reasons, right? But because it allowed them to make the benefit recipients in their regions aware that they were being treated so much better than all the other citizens of the country, and thus they knew to whom their gratitude was due. Right? And particularly important before 2004, when governors were still elected, more or less directly. Case number 3, right? Housing reform. Again, problems of waste and corruption in the system, right? So most people in Russia, of course, privatized their housing right in the early years of post-Soviet Russia, right? But what you ended up with was ownership of the apartment you lived in, but not the building in which it was situated, and not the land on which the building stood, right? So particularly in cities like Moscow, right, as the city grows, as the economy grows, the land, of course, ends up being worth a whole lot more than the apartments on it, particularly in older buildings, right? At the same time, and of course, so there's one problem, that the owners of these apartments don't have a stake in that. Right? The city essentially has very easy eminent domain, right, over all of the buildings. The housing and utility sector also was dominated by inefficient, sort of rent-leaking municipal bureaucracies. Right? That, again, because all of the buildings were owned by the city, it was up to the city to decide who was going to service the buildings. Again, lots of opportunities for waste and corruption in ways that probably won't be too unfamiliar even to residents of privatized New York. Again, a textbook reform. You create homeowners associations or condominium associations, right? You give people the opportunity to come together as all of the owners of apartments in a building, create a legal entity which then is supposed to be granted ownership of the building by the city. That association then makes a decision about who services the building, and if at some point they decide to sell the land, for example, to redevelop the neighborhood, right? The homeowners get the value not just of their apartment but of the land that it stands on. Right? This was sabotaged again from two different levels. Right? So you get middle-level elites, particularly municipal elites, sabotaging the process. Right? So the Moscow government, in particular, essentially refuses to transfer land ownership to homeowners associations, and even when it does allow these associations to be formed, it railroads people into massive multi-building homeowners associations that, lo and behold, turn out to be run by ex-municipal officials, in some cases not even ex-municipal officials, but currently serving municipal officials, who quickly decide to hire private building managers at exorbitant fees, who turn out to be the same people who had been mismanaging the buildings as city employees prior to the reform. Right? So trust is undermined, obviously, from that level, but there's also a social problem, right? So particularly in older buildings, it's a bit easier in buildings built after the end of the Soviet Union, but most people don't live in those. In older buildings, you have a lot of socioeconomic heterogeneity, right? So you've got young people living next to older people, you've got essentially rich people living next to poor people in the same building, and unless you manage to pry open the steel door of the apartment, you don't know what's inside and who's inside, right? This becomes a barrier to coordination, right? Interests and the ability to pay, right, were too disparate within buildings, right, and too widely distributed among neighbors. And so there's both no public trust in these institutions of homeowners associations, again undermined by mid-level officials, but also very little inherent trust in one's neighbors, right? And in the ability of people to come together as a group to create something like a public good or a club good for this group of people living in the building. According to the few opinion polls that have been done, there's most people who participated in homeowners associations have had a fairly negative experience. And actually, I can add myself to that number. So, what does all this mean? My hypothesis, right, and this is what I'd like to then go spend 3 years testing in the field, is that there's three structural factors at work. One comes back to this idea of aggressive immobility, right? So the learned reliance on personalized problem solving, right? On self-reliance, right? Privileges proximate resources, privileges things that are close to you, right? And individual action rather than recourse to things that seem abstract and distant, like the law, or collective action, right? And this turns out to be enough to stop pretty much any reform that falls foul of these sorts of sensibilities. So we've seen that the state exam, it's in place, but it's has not had the impact that the state wanted it to have. It's been its actual implementation has been undermined. We've seen that in the homeowners associations. We certainly saw that in benefits reform, right? So this lack of structure, this lack of institutionalization, right, has an enduring power that is not coming simply from the top down, right? There's something defending that unstructuredness of Russian life, right, from the bottom up as well. Mid-level elites also, and this is unsurprising, I think, share this preference for personalized exchange, right? They like to have access to individuals, right, which often, ironically, right, creates a community of interest between mid-level elites and collective actors, mass actors, right, who might rise up and protest for something against something, for example, like benefits reforms, right? This is to a certain extent surprising because most people in Russia don't like bureaucrats. Probably not too different from any other place, right? But perceptions of low-level corruption have been and remain fairly high, right? And most people, in fact, try to avoid having transactions with these people because they know it's probably not going to end very well for them, right? But they also turn out to be something of a problem-solving resource, right? And people are resistant to attempts by the state to remove these resources. Mid-level elites themselves, while they're theoretically part of Putin's sort of vertical of power that we talk about so much, right? Often will line up with the masses to undermine a reform that has the support of Putin and his government, right? Rather than lining up with government, right? So again, this bottom-up sort of pull of informality seems to be at least as strong a factor in shaping the behavior of people in the middle of the system of power as the formal authority of the state from the top down. And lastly, when the interests of mass actors, of ordinary citizens, and these mid-level elites diverge, then there becomes an opportunity actually to end up with a community of interest between the people at the very top of the system, so essentially Putin and his government, and the masses to act against mid-level elites. What I think is the best example of that is what's happened with monotowns, right? So Russia is, as you'll know, is dotted with a lot of sort of Soviet-era industrial communities that were built around a single factory or a single set of factories working in a single sector. These have never been terribly efficient, right? And when Russia was hit by the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, there was a government decision that we should do something about this, right? This is in fact too expensive to maintain. And that decision, in fact, was driven by these mid-level elites. It was driven by governors and regional governors and mayors who were sick of having to pay for these communities, right? But as it turned out, despite the fact that there was no money to be earned in these cities and no prospect of getting the economy on the rails, right? So the easy solution, quote-unquote easy solution, was to find ways to encourage people to move out to other cities where there was more economic opportunity, right? People didn't want to do that. People didn't want to leave. And one of the key reasons people didn't want to leave was, again, that was unsettling to their personalized, their localized coping mechanisms. They knew how to deal with the schools living in Pikalyovo or Zabaykalsk, right? They knew how to deal with the healthcare. They knew because they knew the people. Right? They knew where things were located. They knew the interest. They knew how to manage these transactions. You move them to somebody where they might be able to earn more money, right? But then they are in an environment they assume is going to work by similar personalized rules, but with a different set of people. Right? And that's a challenging and a very scary thought, right? If you think that's how your world is likely to work. Right? So in this instance, it was the top of the system and the bottom of the system, so the Putin essentially and the masses who came together to undermine the interests of mid-level elites and kill the monotone reform more or less in its tracks. Right? So again, we see the ability of public sentiment, right, to force the government to abandon a material policy against the interests of parts of the elite who we would have assumed, in fact, to be Putin's core constituency, right? Not the voters. We talk about Russia as an authoritarian system in which the elites are powerful and the masses are not. Right? So we see a number of examples, I think, in which it seems to be a lot more complicated than that. And on that note, I'll stop.
Okay, makes sense. All right, questions? Sam, do you want to take the questions? Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for an amazing talk, and I have a couple of questions. First is, I completely agree that a lot of Russian people find it convenient that they're able to solve these problems on this local, personalized level by knowing the right people. But I also think there's a strong interaction with like the lack of trust and feeling of injustice. What I mean is, it's not that I just like the unified state exam, I guess, is a good example. It's not that a lot of people are saying that, oh, I want to have this opportunity that like I'll be able to pay bribe and my son will get in. It's kind of that people don't trust the government because the corruption actually became worse in the mind of a lot of people. It moved to not to a school level, but rather to a regional level. You know, like this very popular argument that students in regions like Chechnya and Dagestan, like they get 100 points and they are able to get in any university. But this lack of trust. So like in the areas like driving licenses or military service, it's not that people, oh, I want to be able to buy a driving license. It's that if some kind of reform is introduced, the right people who have the power, they will still be able to buy this, but we won't. So there's this injustice thing. So what do you think about that? And also second, if you think that, I guess it's kind of a Soviet heritage to some extent, so do you think there's some kind of dynamics? So like, do you think the younger people who were born after 1992, they're like different in this?
So on the first question, I think you're probably right. I mean, what I would one of the key questions about this, right, is what are the limits and the boundaries of all of this, right? So if there are if there's an inherent preference, right, for these sort of informalized mechanisms, right? It's likely to be driven by at least several things at the same time, right? So the experience, actually it works, right? And people tend, again, to have preferences for the things that have been proven to work rather than the things that might work if you gave them a chance. And that's true anywhere, right? But also, you know, there is as you're saying, there is very little reason for people to believe, right, that if they gave things a chance, right, that things would work better. Right? There's very little in contemporary. Well, there's very little in the last 30 years of Russian experience, right, that would lead people to believe that if you created an impersonalized, institutionalized set of processes, right, to handle life cycle challenges, right, like education, housing, healthcare, that sort of thing, that it would, in fact, work the way it's supposed to. Right? And that's, again, born of born of experience. Most people tend to be risk averse, and again, that's not just a Russian thing, right? But it is when you have been through the scale of the transformation that Russia's been through, it does seem to increase or decrease people's tolerance for risk and decrease impersonalized trust, right? So I think that's all going to be part of people's of the reasons people are making these decisions. The question is, what are the boundaries, right? So are there situations in which, in fact, the corruption or the dysfunction is seen as so bad that there would actually be a preference for an institutionalized solution, right? And of course, there are only, you know, the cases I've talked about and looked at so far are ones in which the state has tried to do something. There are plenty of areas in which there might well be demand for more impersonalized governance, or for more institutionalized governance, for example, regulation of small businesses, right? Where the government's simply not offering that, right? It's not on the table for people to get, and so we don't really know how people would respond to it if it did happen. But you might imagine that there would be more demand. I think we also have to allow for a lot of differences, right? I've spoken about 140 million people as if they all think with the same mind, and of course they don't, right? So people are living in different communities, people have different kinds of support networks, people have different cultures of solidarity depending on ethnicity, religion, profession, region, level of education, all kinds of things, right? So those are going to play a role in people's thought processes. What I'd really like to do is spend some time understanding how these thought processes come together. Right? Age, of course, is one of those things. And so on to your second question, right? Is the generation that doesn't remember the Soviet Union, maybe even doesn't really remember the 90s, right? Are they going to think about things differently? I think there is some evidence that they are thinking about politics a little bit differently, right? That they haven't had the opportunity to participate in the legitimation of this current regime, right? There are some things that we are happy to inherit from our parents, and there are some things that we're not, right? As young people, so there is a potential for generational difference. But I don't see anything in their experience either, right, that would point to the reliability of impersonalized institutions, right? So I still think that even the younger generation would have quite a hill to climb before they were going to invest their energies in supporting a reinstitutionalization of economic life in particular, right? That has very little experience behind it.
So very interesting talk. Thank you very much. One example that comes to mind of this interesting interaction between sort of mid-level and mass level perception of these reforms and how they are experienced is this public procurement reform that is a big deal in Russia. And in that case, there is definitely sort of a very heavy-handed sort of solution that was delivered from the top down, and neither masses nor the mid-level bureaucracy are happy with this solution. So it is in place only by force of the sort of central government, and there are some particular acute cases where it not only doesn't work, but leads to some tragic situations, like cases of Moscow theater directors who are suffering from some imperfections of the systems. But I think in this case and in other cases you mentioned, one sort of, it's a little bit hard to compare the old system and this in the cases where a new one was built.
Yeah.
The old system exists sort of by inertia from the Soviet times, and it is sort of it's like many things in the Soviet Union, they were owned by everybody, that is by nobody. And so they are so, they are so opaque that it's basically impossible to control them. Which means that they are well situated for each particular person with enough initiative to carve out their own part of the system when they need it. the systems that are built in place of them, they they're well controlled, but this control is so unaccountable that people really have no opportunity to fine tune it. In some cases, in some cities, it might be the case, but generally speaking, it is very resistant to any kind of course correction. And even changes that do happen, they happen not, in directions that not necessarily needed by either bureaucracy or sort of consumers or people participating in the system. So with this, lack of responsiveness of the system, no representation whatsoever from the people, it's, I think, if people would have the opportunity to participate in the governance of these new systems, then their buy-in into them would be to a much higher degree than it is now.
Yep.
They see that if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. There's no way to change it, adjust, to change in economic circumstances, regional differences. They're extremely sort of rigid in how they are implemented. And so, in this sense, it's not just that, like what Russians like to call mentality or people's attitudes. It's also that the old system, surprisingly, is more whatever small level of control that people can exert over it through maybe some personal means and money, it is higher than in the new system.
I wouldn't dispute that. I mean, so there's a couple of things, right? So there's, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but there's a chapter in the book on civil society, right, that looked at sort of civil rights organizations, basically, mobilization to try to get the police and the prosecutors and the courts to play by the rules, right? And even in the new system, right, the current, what you're describing is the new system, right? You can force the police, right, and the courts and the prosecutors to do things by the book, right? And you can every once in a while get somebody out of prison. Every once in a while, you can even get a police officer punished for abuse, right? But you do it by making non-compliance more difficult for them than compliance, right? So you simply bombard them with paperwork, essentially, because it has been retained from the Soviet system, right? A very proceduralist, sort of rules-based approach. If somebody files a заявление, right, you have to respond to that within a certain period, and if you don't, then it gets escalated, right? And that does work. And in fact, it's begun to work even a bit more than it used to, right? So that is there. I don't think that most people, though, would look at that as governance, right? Because analytically, I wouldn't look at it as governance, because it's not yet systematically creating compliance, right? Still, the default is non-compliance or skirting the rules, or at least to leaving yourself some leeway, right? And it takes a lot of work and investment of time, energy, and money for individuals or organizations to force it to work, right? But I think what this points to, and something that I think you're getting at, is a broader set of assumptions about governance. Right? I don't think that the big political sort of divide in Russia is between people who think that the country is well governed and people who think it's poorly governed. Right? It's between people who think it's poorly governed, and if you elected somebody new, right, it might get somewhat better, right? And a much larger portion of the population that thinks that it doesn't matter who's in power; it's always going to be poorly governed, right? And so the task, right? If you're in Navalny, for example, is to begin to shift that. Is to take some of those people who don't believe that electing somebody new or getting more involved in governance in general would actually create any any sort of collective outcomes, to get them to a point where they would actually believe that.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. Yana has really interesting research a little bit on,
Yeah, no,
on exactly this.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Okay, that's too much building up.
So-
It's actually it's not about my research, but I guess I wanted so I'm hearing. I have the advantage of hearing this for the second time, and I read the paper at APSA. But so I wanted to maybe push back a little bit on the theoretical structure.
Okay.
So you began with a discussion of what power is
Yep.
in Russia, and I think that's a really interesting and I think underexplored aspect of work on politics in Russia. We don't. It's too easy to describe the system in Russia as this top-down monolithic thing, and then we kind of work around the edges of that assumption. So I think that the most convincing and the most kind of new and interesting part, I think, of what you're saying is these shifting alliances, that the expression of power comes out in all different ways between these, you know, the top, the middle, the kind of middle elites, and then the public, and that they can align in different ways. So, you know, it's, I think, especially surprising when it's done against kind of the top, I would say, right? That becomes really unexpected. So when these policies don't go through, I think there you run into the problem of, as you were saying, that if you don't have consultative or representative forms of government, then you have no way as a government you have no way of testing out policies before you just introduce them to people, and then you get all this backlash, and you kind of quickly pedal back and say, okay, no, that's fine. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of the work. I think in terms of the aggressive immobility, I don't know that I would say that's a sociological argument or that emerges from sociology. I mean, I would say that's the argument Douglas North makes about institutions, right? Institutions are humanly devised constraints that create expectations, and whether they're formal or informal doesn't matter all that much, because it's really about creating expectations and guiding behavior. So I think that the fact that people would prefer to operate within the channels they understand is I think not only expected and obvious, but it works everywhere else too, not just in Russia. And moreover, once things work a certain way, people get invested in that, right? If you take the American case of Obamacare, right, the swing between people who were against it and then experienced it and then became in favor of it and now don't want it repealed is huge, because people get vested in the policies that exist. So I guess I don't have a question per se, but just to kind of push back on the way that the argument is structured, or is the theory structured, because it seems to me that the very interesting question of what is power in Russia, and it's not this monolithic top-down thing that we often resort to thinking about, is a really important question. I think the difficulty there is what does it tell us in terms of predictability about regime change or even kind of change in politics, right? Because then the alliances are sort of more predictable.
Right.
You wouldn't expect necessarily middle elites to align with the public against the top necessarily. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's some circumstance under which that will happen, and maybe that's something that Navalny is trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So thank you very much. There's a lot to think about on the aggressive immobility thing. You're absolutely right. This is not an argument that's just about Russia. I think that it emerged from a frustration with what unfortunately has become, I think, the dominant paradigm terms talk about Russian citizens as passive and as somehow innately and inherently Russian. Right? I don't want to deny Russia its uniqueness, right? But it's no more or less unique than any other country is more or less unique, right? And that's my sociological starting point. That's my methodological individualism here, right? So, it's if you look at at Gudkov, for example, right, growing out of Levada's ideas of Soviet man and into now post-Soviet man is there's something inherently sort of psychocultural and phenomenological about that experience, which yes, I mean, everybody's behavior, right, is shaped to a large extent by their experiences and by their socialization, right? And so all of the things that Russians have been through that others haven't, right, is going to create outcomes that are specific to that process, right? It's specific to that environment, but it happens for reasons that are essentially human and not essentially Russian, right? Essentially social and not essentially post-Soviet. So that on that you're absolutely right, and I need to look back and make sure that I'm being clear enough about that. I do think though that there is something specific about deinstitutionalization. I mean, the only country I look at this in any depth in is Russia. So maybe if I looked at other countries, I would find places that were similar, that if they had similar amounts of degradation of formal institutionalization and signaling, right? That you would find similar outcomes, right? But when the attachment, right, to proven and legible behaviors and solutions, right, is inherently the things that are localized, right? That are ways of dealing with a macro environment that is perceived as very, very threatening and uncertain, right? Then sort of what Hellman described, right, for elites in terms of being jealous of their informational advantages because of where they sit in the system, actually begins to pertain to everybody in the system, right? So again, everybody has their own localized advantage, right? That is built by finding your way to a degree of certainty in an uncertain environment. Right? As a result, any attempt by the state or anybody else, right, to create generalized certainty might be perceived as undermining your competitive advantage, whether you're an elite or whether you're an average citizen. Right? It's a hypothesis that needs to be tested, right? So I do think that what is a generally human and true social process, right, has the potential to lead to very specific outcomes in a specific set of circumstances, right? And so the difference, I think, between sort of aggressive immobility as an idea, and I'm not sure how far I would push that, but the difference between that and sort of a general preference for institutions, right, is that you have to look at the specific institution. Right? I mean, these are informal institutions, localized institutions, personalized institutional behavioral patterns. Right? There's a question about what's the distinction between institutions and practices, and is there one? I mean, we can get very thick into the theory if you want, but yes, these are things to think about. So thank you for that.
I have a question also about aggressive immobility.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something you say, you describe Russian people as this is their future. So how many Russian people do you think are actually aggressively immobile? That's the first question. The second one about Russian opposition. So, well, let's say aggressive immobility is something that you may think is inherently about Putin's majority. And there are estimates that, you know, people thinking about democratic values, that's about 10 to 15% of the Russian population. So how would you break it down? People who are supporting Putin, are they aggressively mobile, or the Russian opposition is also aggressively mobile? And also, in that sense, is the opposition movement essentially failing all the time because they're putting forward reforms which are introducing formal institutions, and this is not something that the majority wants?
So on the first question, I don't know, right? And I don't get now how to know, right? So the purpose of thinking through this is to come up with a research agenda that I can then go and try to get something closer to the answer to that to that question. Fundamentally, you know, if you think about people facing these life cycle challenges, right? They've got two sets of choices to make. One of which is do I look for individualized solutions or collective solutions? Right? Do I want a solution that's only mine, or do I want to work with my neighbors to find a solution that suits all of us? Right? And do I find solutions through formal channels or through informal channels? Right? So I'm interested in trying to understand how people make that decision, or those decisions, and what it is that shapes them and guides them and socializes them into these somewhat artificial, obviously, but categories. In terms of Putin's majority, I mean, again, because I don't, you know, the aggressive immobility idea at this point is an argument, it's a hypothesis rather than something that I can demonstrate. You know, I would be very reluctant to say that the 86% who support Putin are aggressively immobile and the other 14% are not. It's not necessarily about that, right? And I would also challenge the idea that if you've got 86% supporting Putin, then you've only got something less than that, right? Less than 15%, for example, that are, you know, pro-democratic. I think if you talk to people, ask them whether they would like to have accountable and democratic governance, the answer is almost uniformly yes, right? You will find some variation on whether people think they already have it. Most people think that they have some degree of democracy, but no degree of accountability. But then the difference is whether they actually think they could ever get there. And so I think what you sort of asked at the end is the challenge for anybody who's going to oppose Putin, right, or anybody who's going to mobilize people around a different kind of political project, right, is to actually convince people that there is a connection between formal political behavior and macro outcomes, right? So outcomes for society as a whole in terms of how the place runs, right? And that's not, again, just a Russian problem. I mean, when I live in the UK, right, and I look at sort of how people took part or didn't take part in the Brexit referendum, right? And I see a very similar dynamic of people losing faith in the concept of a public good, and so it becomes easier to vote simply to kick the politicians in the teeth rather than thinking about what the actual consequences might be. Right? I'm not sure that's all that distinct from things we've seen in politics here. Right? So again, this is not an exclusively Russian thing.
All right. So thanks for a fascinating talk. I have a bunch of questions, some of which I think overlap with Nona. So if you've already answered them, you can skip them. Start more specific and getting a little more broader. The first question is, why monotowns? Like, why does that logic only hold in monotowns? If the story is you get personalized relationships and that's how you get things done, that should work in apartment blocks in St. Petersburg too. So I didn't understand why you went to monotowns with that. The second thing, and I would push you on, I wanted to push you on this from the start of the talk in terms of like the received wisdom of Russians as passive, or else everything else that you've talked about. But is this a Russian legacy? I mean, that's not surprising I'm going to ask this question. Yeah. Is it a Russian legacy or is it a post-communist legacy? Right? And so when we think about like what have Russians been through that citizens of other post-communist countries haven't been through, our first thought is to drift to loss of empire, right? Like that's the one thing that really distinguishes. The collapse of communism was like a different phenomenon from the empire perspective. But there's been no discussion of that at all in the talk here of motivating this. If this has been about Crimea, we might have been talking about that, right? So is there something else, or are you talking about 300 years of Russian history that's different? So what's the theoretical logic to argue that this is Russian as opposed to post-communist? To push it even further, I think in some of your language, and I know this is early on, so like, you know, whatever, it's not really fair, but like, degree of certainty in people seeking a degree of certainty in an uncertain environment. I mean, I kind of thought I heard that on the day after the U.S. 2016 elections, right? Like, that's Trump's America. People are adrift, you know, globalization, their jobs are disappearing, opioids are, I mean, like, can't you just say that about, you know, like, that's just sort of like post-industrial, post-2000, could you say that about the post-Great Recession everywhere, that people are, you know, looking for certainty in an uncertain environment? Then one big picture question, and maybe this is what you were getting at when you were talking about Ilyana, is like, so as someone who's interested in, who has occasionally pushed back that formal institutions in Russia might matter more than people think they give, one of the big things I always have trouble understanding is how people define informal institutions, right? And when does something stop being an institution? Because I would think that the notion of you can get things done through these personal contacts, like ways of solving problems, like how you get your kid into school, right? And that you talk to this person and you do this, I thought that's what people meant by informal institutions. Like it wasn't, I would say like institutions are routinized patterns of behavior, and formal institutions are routinized patterns of behavior that are written down in laws, right? Someone wrote down somewhere you're supposed to do this, and informal ones are things that people know that weren't written down in laws, that might be illegal, that might be circumventing it. So just to, maybe this is just a suggestion going forward, like I got confused during your talk, because when you started talking about deinstitutionalized Russia, it actually sounded, similar to a Jessica Pisano sort of informal institutions are more important than formal institutions. And I guess I'd like to understand what's the difference between an argument about deinstitutionalization versus informal institutions, because I don't see how you can be used to deinstitutionalization and have routinized patterns of behavior without us calling it informal. And then the final thing is like, I did feel like there was a disjunction between the beginning of the talk about power and then everything that followed it. And so I found both parts interesting, but I wasn't sure exactly what they had to do with each other. So like, maybe I want to give you a chance to sort of wrap them back together or even ask like, why make this talk about power? This talk seems to be much more about, all the examples you gave weren't really about power, they were more about strategies within, more like the title of the talk, but more like strategies within a policy-making environment. How do you deal with this kind of situation?
Right.
Anyway,
Okay.
Thanks. Really provocative.
Let me start with the last question, and we're going back up. So, power. If you think of power, again, as visible in a process of interaction, right? The received wisdom, if you just take a very basic story about Russia as an autocratic state, right, is that in all of these cases, right, the government should have just been able to decide this is what we're going to do, and then it should have been what happened, right? In all of these cases, that's not what happened, right? Clearly, there is power located in other parts of the system as well, right? And so what I was looking for was, yes, we know that even an autocratic state is limited, right? But can we look for patterns in those limitations to see if we can find patterns in the ways in which the state fails?
So it's a
to
theoretical
achieve
set of
things.
predictions
Right.
about limitations on power.
Exactly, right. So can we, if we think about power from that, can we develop that theoretical set of expectations, which we can then test in other cases, right? So that's how it's meant to be connected. Clearly, the question suggests that I can make that connection clearer. So thank you.
Yeah.
On boundaries of institutions, Jessica actually and I had this conversation yesterday, and it's a really good question, and there's tons of disagreement about it in the literature, right? So I think we would agree on the definition of an institution, right? So for me, I think the difference between there is a difference between an informal institution and simply a localized non-institutional practice, right? So
But I thought that was an informal institution.
it's so again on some level, right? An informal any institution to be an institution has to have an informal has to have an impersonal aspect to it, right? It's hard for me to think of something as an institution if, in order to have any prediction about the outcome, I have to know the person, the biography, something personal, right, about my interlocutor, right? Then it's no longer institutional, right? If I can walk in, even if we're playing by rules that are not written down somewhere, but I know what the rules are and I know how they're going to govern the other person's behavior, then I think we're beginning to rise to the level of an institution, right? So even something like Blot, right, falls apart in the 90s because the positions that people have in the administrative hierarchy that make Blot work, right, are no longer meaningful, right, or at least no longer reliably meaningful, right? So you get this sort of reliance on specifically the people you know, right? People talk about sort of the breakdown of trust in post-communism, I don't think that's, in fact, entirely true. It just relocates to different places. There's a lot of trust. In fact, people exhibit more trust and more reliance on those close to them, right? And on those with whom they have some kind of a connection than they otherwise would, right? In other situations where, in other countries, for example, where the environment didn't make that trust so important, didn't make those personal connections so important, right? So, not to say there wasn't a personalized aspect to block as well, right? But what you were able to trade in that kind of classical blot system, right, on not just who you were, but where you were in the system, right? And so there was an impersonal aspect to it, and I think that then.
But Sam, if I can push you
yes.
on that, your story that you gave as the example of this was knowing how to get your kids into school.
Yeah.
Right, and that seems like exactly what you just described as an informal institution. You know that regardless who the teacher is, you can show up and pay them. So that doesn't sound like it's de-institutionalized.
No, that I think is an informal institution. Yeah. It's an informal institution, however, that is creating adverse consequences from the government's perspective, in fact. If the government is actually serious about having a well-functioning higher education system, that's not a good way to run university admission. Right? So that's, I mean, I think there is a challenge in this paper at the moment, and that I'm probably attacking too many questions at once, right? So there's at least two fundamental questions here. One is what's going on between informality and institutionalization, right? The other is what are the limitations on power, right? On the state's power. And those aren't inherently the same question. And I think that's part of the tension there in me trying to figure out how to answer this question.
Jump in if you put your finger on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just clarification question. I just can't really think of a single example where you really need to know someone personally. Like you always, like someone knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy, and that's enough. Like in any case that I kind of thinking of. Like,
You can't think of one.
Yeah, can you give an example?
Yes, I can give an example of one. I almost rather this didn't go live, but I've told it.
It is live, so just be aware of that before you give the
So
answer.
when years ago, probably enough years ago that the statute of limitations on this one is probably out. I needed to register a car, right? So I went to for personal sort of family reasons. This was happening out in sort of somewhere in the Moscow Oblast. I won't say exactly where. So I show up with this car and wait for hours for them to inspect it. And I finally get all the way through the process, and you get to the little window, and there's a gaishnik sitting behind the window, and he takes all the papers and then shoves them back, and he says there's a problem with the original import permit on the car. You need to go get it. I didn't import the car. It doesn't matter. But still, it's my job to then go to the customs and fix it, right? Except that I didn't import it, so I can't go to customs. So I'm stuck. Right? So I called the people who sold me the car, and they said, no, in fact, according to the customs law, right, all the paperwork is correct, right? And they quoted me the customs law, right? And I printed it out and highlighted the right paragraph, right? And I showed up at the same sort of traffic police station the next day, right? And it's the same guy behind the window, and he says, it's you again. And I said, exactly. And I said, but this time I got the customs law. And he says, great, but I've got the Dorozhny Codex, but I've got the road law, right? And they contradict each other, right? So I'm standing there saying, what the hell do you want me to do about this, right? And this is a classic situation. My wife, who was Russian, thought, as we were talking about this the night before, that part of the problem might have been that they wanted money, right? And I was, either too stupid to understand that, or they didn't quite know how to ask me for it because I'm clearly not Russian myself. Right? And so she sent my father-in-law with me, right? So my father-in-law is sitting there doing the crossword puzzles as I'm having this conversation with the gaishnik. He sees that things are getting agitated, and he comes up and pokes his head through the window, right? He pokes his head through the window, sees the gaishnik sitting there, and says, "Seryoja." And the Gaishnik looks at him and says, Andrusha. They went to high school together, right? So they're like talking about, you know, ex-girlfriends and how their kids have done, right? And the Gaishnik, you know, Seryoja, you know, puts a stamp in my document, and I'm out the door. If it weren't for that highly personalized relationship, I'd probably still be standing there.
You would probably you could just pay some money.
Potentially, although I actually tried to do that the day before and it didn't work. And maybe I've never tried to do that before, right? So, I mean, I went to talk to the boss the day before, thinking he would tell me how much I would have to pay, and he just said, go away. In any case, I mean, there are no perfectly impersonal situations, and there are no perfectly formal situations. There are always gradations, right? So I don't want to be very black and white about this. What I'm trying to do, on the other hand, is to sort of identify the various sort of categories, so that I can then go and study the sort of distribution of people's thought processes. Yeah.
So I just want to suggest maybe a difference between formal and informal that doesn't hinge on personal interaction. The sanctions that are enforced for failing to follow formal rules,
right,
following institutions, are enforced by a third party, the state.
Yeah.
They're not maybe perfectly enforced. We know that in Russia it's selectively enforced. The sanctions enforced for not following informal institutions is that you don't get what you want. No, there's no third party enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
It's just your loss or the other person's loss. It's just kind of thinking from your example right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you say it is Ulyukayev, right? So, you know, who's just been sentenced to 8 years.
But that's the great paradox of Russia, the fact that the rules apply selectively.
Right.
The rules apply to everyone except they don't. They
Yeah,
apply
but we don't think that he was actually convicted for a formal violation, right? So, but yes, it's a good way of it's something to go away and think about. Josh, on your legacy question, right? I do think it's I think it's a legacy of dislocation. It's a legacy of breakdown, which does mean it's a post-communist legacy rather than a Russian legacy, except that not every country broke down the same way, right? So I would expect that, you know, breakdown in Russia is very different to breakdown in GDR or, you know.
Yeah, that's a much more powerful theoretical
Yeah.
argument,
Yeah.
rather than saying it's Russian or post-communist, is to call it, say what
Yeah.
it was, which
Yeah.
is breakdown, and then
Yeah.
you can get variation across the countries,
Yeah.
and you can get them in and out of the post-communist world, you know. So
Yeah.
I think I would push it.
And then very briefly on why monotowns. Yes, the same logic should apply everywhere, right? Except
You wouldn't
that,
have gotten your permit in
except the
Moscow.
monotowns are the only place where they are, well, until now in Moscow, is the only time where they're massively trying to move people out of their dwellings. Right?
Oh, so just a good example.
So, yeah.
But the logic should.
The logic should hold, and I think that's part of why we're seeing a lot of resistance to people being
The
moved in
Khrushchevs, yeah.
in the renovations in Moscow. But also just because if you tell 900,000 people that we're going to kick you out of your apartments in the next 2 years, some of them are going to get angry anywhere, even in Russia.
Any other questions? All right, well, Sam, thanks so much. This was fantastic. Thank you.